Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Could you please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance and remain standing for a statement of values? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
As we gather, we humbly seek blessings upon this meeting. May we act with strength, courage, and will to perform our obligations and duties to our people with justice to all. Let us seek wisdom so that we may act in the best interest of our people, our neighbors, and our country. All this we ask so we may serve our community with fairness and respect, putting their needs before all.
Thank you. Please be seated. Roll call.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Before roll call, I'd like to note for the record that in accordance with the Brown Act, Government Code Section 54953B, Councilmember Shahal is attending tonight's meeting via audio-only teleconference. The location from where Councilmember Shahal is attending was included on the agenda for this meeting. Councilmember Shahal, at this time, I ask you to confirm that the agenda for this meeting is posted at your teleconference location and that this location is accessible to the public. Councilmember Shahal, can you hear me?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Yes, I did post the agenda as required.
Thank you very much. And the location is accessible to the public?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Please also state whether any members of the public are in attendance at your teleconference location.
No one is there.
Okay, perfect. All votes taken during this teleconference meeting shall be by roll call vote. And with that, I shall begin. Board Member Gonzalez? Oh, Chair Gonzalez, sorry. Board Member Shahal?
Present,
Board
remotely.
Thank you. Board Member Hardy?
Present.
Board Member Park?
Here.
I'd like to note for the record that Board Member Jane is absent from this meeting. And Board Member Cox?
Here.
And Chair Gilmore?
Here.
Thank you.
Motion to excuse Council Member Jane.
Second.
We have to remember tonight it's all stadium authority.
Yes.
Unanimously of those present.
The AB 23 announcement, members of the Santa Clara Stadium Authority are entitled to receive $30 for each attended meeting. A statement of behavioral standards. The City of Santa Clara has adopted a code of ethics and values and behavioral standards for public meetings to promote and maintain the highest levels of conduct. This includes mutual respect, robust discussion, and allowing city business to be done in an efficient and consistent manner. Please note that as a presiding officer, the chair's direction in matters of process and decorum should be followed, and that use of the gavel indicates all conversations must conclude and everyone in attendance should come to order and attention. Welcome and thank you for your participation. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Did you do the lobbyist thing? That's what I wait to hear.
If we have, so this is for any registered lobbyists that join us this evening. In that capacity, please identify yourself as such and disclose the clients and/or organizations that you represent. This is pursuant to City Code Section 2.155.110. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Good evening, everyone. For tonight's meeting, the Stadium Authority is back in person and is conducting its meeting in a hybrid manner. The public is welcome to attend in person, and the Stadium Authority continues to use a Zoom feature to allow participation from your home or office. Members of the public can still join via the link or call into the Zoom meeting phone number shown on the screen now. If you would like to speak on an agenda item, please raise your hand on the Zoom application or press *9 on your phone. Please only raise your hand to ensure Stadium Authority attorney.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Stadium Authority did meet in closed session on item 1 as identified on the agenda, conference with legal counsel regarding anticipated litigation, both with respect to the potential for initiation of litigation and exposure to litigation. However, there was no reportable action. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have one item on the agenda tonight, and it is a study session. Study session discussion of the proposed Santa Clara Stadium Authority fiscal year 2026-27 operating, debt, service, and capital budget and Stadium Authority budget, compliance and management policies and marketing plan. And this is continued from February 24th, 2026. Executive Director.
Sure. Thank you, Chair Gilmore and members of the board. Javon Grogan, Executive Director of the Stadium Authority, and good evening. This, yes, is a study session with regard to the budget for the upcoming fiscal year that will begin April 1st, 2026 and run through March 31st, 2027. It is both on the proposed budget as well as the marketing plan, compliance, and other management policies. We have a presentation for you today that will recap a number of the questions you asked as well as provide responses. As the board knows, we have 45 days upon which 45 days after we receive the proposed budget, we have to act on it. And so it is a very tight timeline. And you know that we have been engaged in a number of question and answers with our stadium manager. Also worth noting today is I do believe that we will have representatives from the 49ers management company online to support this discussion and respond to questions. So with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Treasurer Ken Lee. You also have myself, Stadium Authority Counsel Glenn Guggens, as well as staff that support the Stadium Authority year-round here in the audience to support your deliberations and questions. Important to note, no actions are envisioned tonight. Action on the budget is scheduled for March 10th, your very next regularly scheduled meeting this coming Tuesday. With that, Director Lee.
Thank you, Executive Director Grogan. Good evening, Honorable Mayor Chair Gilmore, members of the Stadium Authority Board, members of the public. My name's Ken Lee, Director of Finance, also serving as Treasurer for the Stadium Authority. Appreciate the opportunity to continue to talk about this very important topic, our Stadium Authority budget, by way of, looks like it just, I don't know if the comms team could put it back into slide mode there. Just by way of agenda tonight, I'll talk about an overview. I will not repeat all the slides I did last week, but the focus of tonight will be responding to the board's questions from last week. So I'll have a quick summary, talk about the question and answer, and then the recommendation. As a reminder on this slide, just the tight timeline required to produce this budget, largely dictated by our lease agreement with the stadium manager, the 49er Stadco. I do want to highlight here, we are in the second study session here, March 5th, and next Tuesday, staff will have before you the recommendations based on the feedback we heard from you, based on question and answers and additional analysis that my staff, finance staff, has been working with Manco even up to today and this week on. And so that will be before the board next Tuesday. The executive director mentioned 45 days, so we do need to provide a notice of approval or disapproval of elements of the budget, if any, on that March 13th date. And then shortly thereafter, a stadium manager would submit that budget to the trust in terms of from a financing and cash management perspective. Just for background, those at home, this budget includes all the elements of a typical public sector budget, in this case, operations, debt service, capital budgets, and so almost 10 pages of line item capital budgets included in the submittal before you. There's also a handful of attachments even for tonight's item. It includes the staff report, the staff presentation from last Tuesday, so if there's any reference to my original presentation, that is also there available, attachment number 7, and then written question and responses included for full transparency to the public. I will also go through those question and answer as part of my presentation to read them into the record, and then offer an opportunity at the end for additional board questions. As far as the numbers in the budget, in total, when you look at operations, including Stadium Authority staff, debt service budget, and capital expenditures, and then when you adjust for some of the ins and outs of the different funds, $81 million of activity for one fiscal year, and that will likely be higher as we have actual non-NFL events in the stadium and the bowl, closer to and upward of $100 million typically annually. Want to remind the public, the council, of some of the key themes that I went over last Tuesday in the Stadium Authority budget. The first bullet there is around net non-NFL event revenue. These are the ticketed events, the concerts, the sporting events that we have at the stadium. Currently budgeted at 4.6. Later in the Q&A, I'll talk about the second main bullet here, public safety cost reimbursements. That's been a topic over the last several years, and so this budget includes both revenues from the non-NFL ticket surcharge, $1.9 million assumed here, as well as dollars from our discretionary fund to fully cover what's obligated for public safety costs over the threshold. As part of the 2024 settlement, it was a balance, and so the third sub-bullet here shows that we expect that to be paid off at the end of 26-27, so in the budget that you're considering today. And then the last bullet, as you are aware, major events continuing at the stadium through July, so this budget continues to support those events as they occur. This next slide here, direct payments to the general fund. So if I put on my Director of Finance hat here, the city receiving $6.6 million there in the form of performance rent, excess revenue projections, ground rent, and senior and youth fees. And so a critical revenue stream to our city. And then the last bullet here, one of the main themes as the stadium facility in and of itself, and in order to maintain that as a world-class facility, as we've seen on the world stage, a significant investment will be needed to keep that stadium in top shape. It's roughly 14 years old, and so working with our stadium manager, their recommendation is an additional $5.7 million in CapEx projects pending the finalization of a facility condition assessment. It also includes carryover projects, so when projects start or are planned and when the fiscal year ends, typically the project doesn't conclude, and so there's a handful of recommendations in the budget for carryover projects, contingencies in light of tariffs and increasing construction costs. And then, as I mentioned last Tuesday, with regards to the 10-year forecast for our city's general fund, because of that large capital investment necessary, one of the trends that as an authority we'll focus in on is that impact to excess revenue, to future contributions for capital, and the implications on the agency and on the city. So in this next section, a lot of pages here, but hopefully with the Q&A responses here, wanted to be thorough with all the questions that the board and the chair had raised. And so I'll go page by page through the Q&A, and then at the end, if there are more questions or if we didn't address one of them, happy to answer those at the end. And so on this slide 9, the question was asked around revenues versus expenses. Revenues increased by 3%, expenses by 7%. What's kind of the net income? And so staff took a look at, on an ongoing basis, operating revenues, debt service revenues, which are based on the fees charged at select hotels around the stadium, our operating expenses, our annual debt service expense, and then our base capital expense requirements that produces a net revenue of $7.8 million there on that chart. Do want to highlight in the footnote there that doesn't include roughly $12 million of carryover projects, and so that as those funds are available at the end of the year and carried over, that's why that capital budget is much larger at $22 million. And then the $5.7 million I mentioned in my prior slide, That's proposed to be funded out of our operating reserve, out of one-time dollars. But just taking a look at an operational perspective around net income in the positive there. The next slide, next question, why is the distribution to the general fund not negatively impacted in 26-27? And our response, it is impacted, and so our projection actually declines from $4.7 million in the current year budget to $3.6 in next year's proposed budget, largely due to that additional CapEx expenses that we talked about. And so from year to year, the revenues may vary depending on the type of events, the number of events. And so based on our projections here, there is still an impact to the general fund for next year, roughly $1.1 million when you look from a year-to-year basis here. The next question, how will increased capital funding needs affect the frequency and size of future city general fund distributions? And so that is a key theme, that is a key concern here, as indicated in the 10-year forecast included in the budget document here. After 26-27, there is no forecasted excess revenue to the general fund. That's largely due to the increased investment in capital expenses. And so as we look ahead even beyond 26-27, it is important work for the Stadium Authority to confirm and validate that facility condition assessment report performed by our stadium manager, prioritize those projects and have a discussion with the stadium manager on what are the top projects necessary for our stadium. And then with regards to some of the lower level projects, understand what are the trade-offs, the cost benefit of those lower priority projects to ensure that our very limited capital dollars are spent in the wisest and the most impactful way. The next question, are the Stadium Authority reserves expected to keep pace with capital expenditure needs? And so we do highlight in our forecast that our reserves are expected to grow over the 10-year period. Those are entirely driven by the amounts outlined in our lease agreement that do include inflation factors. And so the assumption here is operating revenues from an annual basis will continue to fill those operating and capital reserve buckets. As I've mentioned, as you know, that theme will depend largely on projects as we look ahead and what actual reserve balance will be needed to cover those investments. The next question, there's a 26% decrease in non-NFL events forecasted for fiscal year 26-27. How can the Stadium Authority fulfill its oversight to maintain profitability when it comes to non-NFL events? And so it's a two-pronged answer here. The first part, as I mentioned earlier, is just the timing and the methodology. When we're before you, bringing the stadium manager's proposals, they're looking at what's actually booked to date. And so the goal here is, as they continue to engage with vendors, with promoters, that additional events would get booked, we would receive and earn additional revenues. We've seen that the last few years from a process standpoint. We'll continue to dialogue with our stadium manager to make sure that when we're projecting that we're accurate, we're sufficiently aggressive, as well as looking at the likelihood of the booking of some of those events. Additionally, the Stadium Authority has hired a consultant, Canyon Oaks, to conduct market research around large venues such as Levi's stadiums and compare with other stadium markets what are typical non-NFL event trends. And so that report and that analysis is ongoing. Some of those results will be brought forward both to staff and to the board later on in this calendar year. What fund will cover public safety costs expected to be reimbursed by the Bay Area Host Committee if those reimbursements are delayed, reduced, or disputed, and Stadium Authority is required to pay any portion that exceeds the amounts available in the Public Safety Cost Reserve and Discretionary Fund? And so we are, on an ongoing basis, invoicing the Bay Area Host Committee. That's all the invoicing process, the timeline, and the payment return there are outlined in those specific agreements for FIFA as well as Super Bowl 60. In the event that Bay Area Host disputes any of those costs, there is a meet and confer process. After 2 sessions, then it would go to an arbitrator that would then determine whether those costs are should be paid or not. And assuming for both Super Bowl and FIFA, any of those amounts that are considered to be undisputed or owed, there is a backstop through the 49ers entity. And then those that are not, that are deemed ineligible to be reimbursed, then Stadium Authority funds would backfill for those costs. And so in no event, based on both the mechanics of the agreements and the backstop for the 49ers, would the general fund pay for any of these costs. The next question, did we meet the number of events required under the naming rights agreement? And if not, who pays the liquidated damages? And so under the naming rights agreement, if there are fewer than 36 major events totaling 25,000 in attendance or more, that's kind of the minimum bar there. And so our stadium management agreement specifies that if that occurs, Manco would pay the Stadium Authority liquidated damages. In that case, the Stadium Authority would be kept whole. And just to note, to date, in our current 3-year period that ends February 28th of 2027, we've had 23. We'll continue to track those and confer with our stadium manager on potential large event bookings. What is the impact to senior and youth fee revenue due to one 49er home game that's played internationally? And is there any mitigation mechanism in place to protect this? And so assuming an average NFL event, 69,000 in attendance, 40 cents a ticket, that's roughly $27,600. Our senior and youth programs funded through our Parks and Recreation Department will continue with that amount there. That would be a loss in general fund revenues, and that's absorbed just within the bucket in the general fund. But those dollars are for very specific youth programs, and those programs will not be impacted, will continue as planned. Is the Stadium Authority under legal obligation to pay for a share of Manco's off-site office space? If not, why has this request come up again? And so, as I mentioned in last Tuesday's presentation, we did receive a request from Manco to fund a portion of office space through the Q&A with our stadium manager. We weren't sure how much at that point in time. Since then, we've worked with them and found that number to be $620,000 a year. The position the Stadium Authority Board took last year and we'll see on Tuesday is that the board did not approve that and disagreed with that expense. And so ongoing conversations between our Stadium Authority staff and our stadium manager on this topic is expected even beyond this budget consideration. And if there's no agreement this year, then that would go through the dispute resolution process outlined in the agreement. And then the feedback, appreciate the feedback on the charts and the budget document. So yes, for our budget next Tuesday, we'll make sure those labels are put on those charts. The question was asked around the additional ticket surcharge over the base $4. Why is it lower than the base? And I appreciate those detailed math questions. And so just wanted to note that because this year's events include our FIFA World Cup events, there was a separate negotiation around non-NFL ticket surcharge. That agreement includes a $6 per ticket surcharge, so that's $4 base, $2 addition. So when you average that out with the other non-FIFA events, that's why that average is slightly lower than the $4. So our non-FIFA events typically is a $6 additional charge on top of the $4, but because of those FIFA events at $6, that brings that average down. Provide more detail behind the economic impact study described in the work plan. And so the economic impact study is related to a civil grand jury recommendation that was brought to the board and to the Stadium Authority around economic impacts We are finalizing the scope of that statement of qualifications, expect to put that out for any relevant economist or consultant to bid on that work. And included in that scope is analysis of events and direct impacts to our city's general fund between 2014, 2021, impacts for the stadium between 22 and 25. And then it does include the large events, Super Bowl and FIFA here. And so hopefully with that solicitation, we'll get a large number of qualified vendors to pick from. And then we'll bring back the outcome of that study back to the board. The next question, this description of the discretionary fund describes that under certain circumstances, the Stadium Authority may transfer to the city's general fund up to half the balance over $1 million. Why is it the balance drops below $1 million? And so a couple of nuances here with regards to the discretionary fund. It has dropped below $1 million in the past, very specifically to pay for public safety costs over the threshold. If the Stadium Authority were to direct dollars to the general fund in general, above and beyond $1 million, then half would have to stay with stadium operations, half to the general fund. Because the $1 million allocated for the civic event from last Saturday was an event that was both included as and contemplated in the stadium lease and approved by Stadco, Manco, our interpretation, as well as Manco and Stadco's, is that balance can drop below $1 million. This next slide, just the comment and feedback for page numbers and tables to be numbered in the marketing plan. That was revised by our stadium manager and included in your packet here tonight. The marketing plan states that overall private non-NFL event output was lower than prior years due to staffing transitions. What is being done to prevent staffing changes from affecting the number of events? So working with our stadium manager on this response, they have implemented several proactive measures, cross-training, marketing and sales functions, documented campaign calendars and standard processes to preserve institutional knowledge, having an advanced transition plan when staffing changes occur, and then having alignment between marketing campaigns and confirmed availability to ensure that everyone's looking at the same available inventory. And so these are some of the elements of that plan to ensure seamless transitions in the event of staff turnover. How can the competition to book events at the convention center versus Levi Stadium be resolved? And so both the convention center and Levi Stadium are operated by two different third-party managers. But however, the city, the Stadium Authority have a direct oversight over those two entities as well as the booking of events. So we are working on coordination between the two venues. There's also our destination marketing organization, Discover Santa Clara, that's also included in that conversation. And so a lot of communications between parties, different boards there to make sure that any issues between competition are resolved. How is the marketing plan leveraging 49ers team fan base and non-NFL private event sales efforts? And so again, working with our stadium manager here around ticket offer, email blasts, promotion both on social media and digital email promotion, advertisements on Ticketmaster, advertisements through the TV and digital TV methods, leveraging the 49ers trade with NBC Sports, and then organic social promotion. And they gave one example here where a 49er player was sent to an earthquake match to promote the event. When will Stadco's facility condition assessment be complete and available for review? So we're in continual communication with them. It's expected this next fiscal year 26-27. Please describe the plan for the Stadium Authority's independent facility condition assessment. What's the scope, the timeline? RFP vendor selection, when will the results be made to the public? And so after this budget process, our Stadium Authority staff will work to develop a scope, put procurement on the street, and coordinate with time ahead of the 27-28 budget process. We know that that investment in capital continues to grow. It is important as an agency to make sure that we have a study that we agree on and can prioritize projects. And so that is forthcoming this coming fiscal year. When will Canyon Oaks complete its review and analysis of the marketing plan and deliver that report? I mentioned this earlier. That draft was submitted to the Stadium Authority on January 30th, some back and forth with staff and recommendations, hopefully in the May-June timeframe. In a couple months, that will be before the board. How many 49er games will be played internationally? And so working with our stadium manager, there is one away game in Australia, one home game in Mexico. I mentioned the impact on senior and youth fees, $27,600. There is also an impact for every home game. The Stadium Authority does collect a NFL ticket surcharge. When we look at just based on projected revenues, typically $1.8 million per NFL game, and so that does have a reduced revenue amount for this coming fiscal year based on that NFL schedule. The question of what is the policy for capital investment into Levi Stadium? How can we maintain the stadium in good working order? As I mentioned earlier, the contributions for capital expenses are dictated by our stadium lease agreement. It starts with a base amount of $2 million. In fiscal year 14-15, it includes an escalation of 3% that grows, and so 13 years later here, that totals $2.9 million, and then as part of the excess revenue distribution, or the waterfall, as I've shown on the chart, an additional $1 million could be allocated with that same 3% escalator, so that's $1.4 million. So when you add those two totals, about $3.5 million for next year, as outlined in our lease agreement. And so the results of the facility condition assessment will be important to determine, is that amount sufficient or not? Typically for an asset this large, that's where the additional investment, as recommended by our stadium managers and with our own Stadium Authority study, will confer the appropriate amount in future years. The question, does the interest revenue include interest earned on the renovation demolition reserve? It does. It includes interest earned on all of our reserve accounts. The Stadium Authority is limited by the lease agreement in terms of types of investment. My assumption here with the goal of capital preservation, and so the funds are invested in a money market account for high-quality securities, earning interest to the Stadium Authority. Why is the interest revenue budgeted lower in 26-27? So a combination of two factors. One is the additional investment in our CapEx, and so drawing from operating reserves because of that lower cash will impact our interest. And then just difficult to predict as the headlines every day almost change from an economic standpoint. So the assumption and direction based on the Fed is those rates are going to tweak down slightly next year, and so that's built in. So a conservative methodology with regards to our budgeting. How can Stadium Authority project non-NFL event revenue in a more realistic manner? So I've talked about this, that we'll continue to dialogue with Manco in terms of both the marketing plan, the booking of events, the likelihood of those events, and inquiring about projected non-NFL event revenue. We will report out actual progress throughout the year through our quarterly reports. How does Stadium Authority debt get paid off if there's a reduction in non-NFL event net revenue? And so two parts to this answer. First, with regards to stadium operating revenues, non-NFL event, while it's an important source, does include many other sources, including the facility rent, ticket surcharge, naming rights, SBL proceeds as those are resold. So that bucket is the source for the payment of debt. In addition, for the CFD, certain hotels levy a 2% tax on rooms that are rented, and so that is also a source to specifically pay for that CFD advance. Talked about that. Since SBL proceeds are projected to decline, at what point will the SBL sales and service contract with Manco get restructured to reflect the declining workload? Why are SBL sales and service costs going up by 6% in 26-27? So working with our stadium manager, just want to distinguish here two different segments of those costs. The first are the sale of SBLs. While the majority of the SBLs have been sold, there are resales in any given year as people defaults or relocate and want to resell them. So our stadium manager has stated that there is a level of staffing required to maintain and remarket and resell, and later in the slides shows some of the metrics around that. And then the services costs around the overall SBLs sold $600 million. That team manages the ongoing relationship with SBL holders, relocation and inquiries. And so that staff time, our response here is just making sure we're working with our stadium manager that the timekeeping and the tracking around these costs are clean. And so we will continue to dialogue around this topic through this budget process and beyond. Can a projection be provided when SBL proceeds will reach zero, and what the total Manco SBL sales and service costs will be between now and that date? And so if no further SBLs were sold, there would be, and no additional defaults or on existing accounts, there's $34 million in remaining SBL proceeds that would be collected over the next 10 years. Those are financed over the 10 years. And then they would taper off around 2036. Typically, there are SBLs that would continue to turn over and financed over 10 years, so that revenue we would expect to trickle down over time. And then working with our stadium manager as far as the range over the next few years, expected $4 to $5 million in new SBL sales from those turnovers. What performance metrics or benchmarks exist to support SBL sales and services costs, and who approves the cost escalation? And so the benchmarks listed here, I won't list them all, but they're around a sales goal of 5 million, calls, touch points, pitches, and then the Stadium Authority Board approves the SBL sales and service cost budget. And so the stadium manager proposes that budget. The board on next Tuesday will evaluate the recommendation from staff regarding that budget. Legal services are projected to be $96,000 in 25-26, but the 26-27 budget is $460,000. Why the large increase? What legal matters do staff expect? Are these tied to disputes? And so we went back and looked at our methodology because our submittal is due to Manco in December of last year. Our methodology looked at expenses through September and straight-lined it, and so that gave us the 96. Staff took a look at that projection again based on actual expenses through January of this year, and so a revised estimate here is $200,000, still higher than the $460 in the budget. So working with our attorney's office or legal counsel office, that budget does include a holistic view of legal work, and that includes attorney fees related to not covered by insurance, any claims, ADA claims, repayments to the city for associated claims on the city side, and that proportion to the Stadium Authority. And then in this case here, it's typically we have had savings, and that is the goal, is to not spend every dollar. But with regards to legal services, we worked with our city attorney here and his staff in coming up with that $460,000 budget. Regarding the Manco offsite office space, when did Manco move? Why did they move? Who authorized them to relocate at Stadium Authority expense? So that move occurred in November of '24. Stadium Authority staff were unaware until this issue came up last year as part of the fiscal year 25-26 budget submittal. They have communicated that the relocation was meant to locate their teams on one site to optimize collaboration, which prior to that, Stadco and Manco staff were located in 2 locations. What is the itemized budget for the other expense line in the budget? And so that was a question our staff asked Manco, and part of that Q&A response, I have the table here. $1.7 million includes $868,000 of support staff time, $230,000 of lender fees or bank fees, and then the offsite office space that I mentioned earlier. We did inquire about the supporting staff time. We did notice that was higher in this budget, so it does include 2 additional project managers that would focus on capital projects as that ramp up is expected to start this coming year. And then with regards to the accounting, debt management staff, the business analytics staff, took a look at those classifications, roughly 15 or 20 positions, totaling 4.5 FTEs in that line item. How much of the Stadium Authority general and administrative budget increase is due to FIFA World Cup 26 event planning? And so I think the question stems from the variance between the projections shown in the budget. And so in this fiscal year 25-26, some positions were vacant. We are projecting a significant savings in G&A this year for Stadium Authority. For next fiscal year, staff budgeted in the authority that work on FIFA-related events will also continue to charge time. That includes Javon's time, my time, council time, as well as staff already budgeted in G&A, and will align with the agreements that were reached with FIFA, Bay Area Host Committee. Should the Stadium Authority wait to commit to Manco's 5-year CapEx plan until the Stadium Authority completes its own facility condition assessment? Very good question. And so the budget that will be before you on Tuesday will include 1 year of approvals. It's fiscal year 26-27 from a legal appropriation spending authority. It does include a 5-year plan. That 5-year plan will get updated annually, very similar to the city budgeting process with capital projects. We do update that on a biennial basis. And that's why it is important for that facility condition assessment to validate, as we look ahead outside of fiscal year 26-27, what are the highest priority projects to fund in the out years. And so I just want to clarify there that the board will consider, from a legal appropriation standpoint, just the 1 fiscal year on Tuesday. Why does performance rent drop in the out years? And so very difficult to forecast 10 years given the information we have. But based on the information we have and some broad assumptions on the number of non-NFL events, both concerts and sporting events, which we assume roughly 5 or 6 per year. That does generate that additional public safety non-NFL event cost, but to the extent that it's not sufficient to cover public safety costs, which also continue to rise, there is a provision within the settlement agreement that performance rent credits could be used to help offset that. And so as we go further out in the forecast, as those assumptions are not known and trying to be conservative with that projection, that's why that performance rent looks to drop. Our goal as a stadium authority will continue to dialogue with the stadium manager to ensure that that net fee, that public safety cost fee, is maximized so that those could cover that threshold. And then the question around the SOMP, why is that confidential? And so it does include operational information related to the daily and event operations, maintenance of the stadium, equipment maintenance, building maintenance. So some of those items on there, including public safety and responses, detail very specific parts of the facility and operations. And so, if made available to a bad actor potentially could pose a safety and security risk. And so that's why that is confidential. That has been transmitted to the board, I believe, via confidential site. And so with that, I hope that answers all the board's questions. I know that this is a lot of detail, a lot of pages of documents. If there are other questions or if I missed any, happy to respond to that. And so our recommendation tonight is not action, but really to receive input from you as a board, from the public, and then what staff will do is work with our executive director to come up with a proposed budget for next Tuesday, which may include recommendations that differ from our stadium manager proposal. And so with that, that concludes my presentation. Appreciate the time.
Thank you, Ken. We're going to come back now to council questions, comments. Authority Member Hardy.
Thank you. I wasn't here last week because I was at a family funeral. So I want to understand some numbers. We have about $209 million in debt still for the building of the stadium. And when we talk about, there were several different numbers. You were talking about $4 to $5 million per year that we're anticipating. Well, if we have about 15 years more of the stadium, that the high end is only 75 million, which worries me. And then you mentioned a number, kind of in passing, a 36 million of what we thought we would take in. So I want to make certain I understand where we're at for paying that outstanding debt. Thank you.
Other questions? Authority Member Cox.
Thank you, Director Lee. Let me go through the packet just one at a time and give you what I wrote down. So on slide number 9, in response to it was the first one, increase of 3%, but expenses increasing by 7%. You mentioned something about that total not including the $12 million capital expense rollover, I believe. So can you further explain that, just what that means in terms of the revenue to expense total? On slide 12, your response about the authority reserves keeping pace with the capital expenditures, the response says the cash reserve balance is going from 103.5 million to 110 million in 35-36, so some meager growth there. I'm trying to understand what we mean by the cash reserve balances. Is that inclusive of all 8 buckets? Are there ones that are just cash operating buckets? One of the things that I found that was interesting as I went back and forth in this is I didn't fully comprehend, and maybe still don't, this process of routinely under budgeting on non-NFL events. And I want to know how that impacts our ability to forecast rationally. Again, I think it's great to understate and overproduce, but I also realize now that creates some limitations on the flexibility we have. And I want to know, obviously we're paid out in the end based on actuals, but that kind of budgeting really limits our clear indicators of what's going forward. And as things are getting tight, I think that we need to put that pressure for accurate budgeting. The volatility in the non-NFL ranges is crazy. I wrote down, so again, one of the questions I asked is, in a worst case scenario, if the Bay Area Host Committee disputes something, the 49ers are found to not be responsible for paying, you said that our funds would pay for it. I want to know specifically, is that our reserve, operating reserve? Is that our discretionary reserve? Where does that come from? I think in general, I want to understand, it seems like since the 24 settlement, what's happened is we've got crafty with the bucket moving in order to, what looks like we want to prioritize making it look like we're making income, but it's been shifting things just on the back end of the house. And so I think that my big question really I don't want to go, I know we'll have more time to do this as we deliberate later, but what I don't see in this budget is an answer to the really pressing question of, we are plateauing right now, and we are at the point for the next 10 years that the only income we are projected to make is our ground rent. So the stadium on paper in this report is no longer a financially viable model. And what I don't see in this budget is a plan to bring that back. And so we are operating with okay, we're here, this is what we've got to work with. But I would say that we have a responsibility to, in this budget, talk about how we can become a profitable entity again. And so I would like, in the response on Tuesday, that there would be some kind of planning built into our budgets going forward that says, how do we deal with a $75 million capital expense reserve and lower income every year with the public safety costs rising, but our threshold not going up for that. There's just a lot that we have room to do, or maybe potentially don't. But with this budget as is, it's kind of a, oh darn, here you go. And so I don't know if that's the responsibility of the director, the city manager, but I know that I would like to see a budget that has a solution instead of just, hey, this is where we're at. No.
Thank you. Councilmember Chahal.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Director Lee, for the report and answering all the questions we submitted last time. I have a follow-up question similar to what Councilmember Cox asked, basically. As the projected general fund revenue from stadium is being diminished, basically, right? And the capital improvement expenses are going up. So my question would be, what tools do we have to make sure we get funds flowing to general fund as we have been seeing in the last couple of years? Do we renegotiate something like increasing ticket surcharges, or what can we do to make sure our general fund gets money flowing as expected, basically? Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Gonzalez.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I guess my question is kind of a comment, but also a question. As far as it looks like the capital expenditures moving forward, are going to increase, right? So typically, having dealt with budgets in school districts, which they require 5%, budget, what do you call it, budgeting 5% for maintenance. Do you see us doing that? If we do that in the future, how can we maintain some level of revenue, understanding that Measure J was there to protect the general fund, but at the same time, it's always beneficial for us to see how we can get more from that stadium, and that economic impact report that we will get. I guess we haven't really sent it, we've compiled the, I think it was an RFP, but we haven't sent it out. When do you foresee us getting some of that information back, as far as, having it so that we can present it to somebody to do it, and then maybe having a report sometime after that, right?
Council Authority Member Park.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, I think a lot of people have brought up the point of diminishing revenues as we go forward, but I think we need to look at that after 30 years, that revenue is going to go to zero. I mean, we have to consider that this is a stadium that has a limited lifespan, and trying to get more and more even the same through the lifespan of the stadium may not be, how you manage a stadium. I know that soon we will have to be looking at, we won't have to pay for the demolition because we have a demolition fund, but we're going to have to make a decision in the future as to what we want to do with that stadium area. We can remove the stadium at no cost to us, but we will not have something that generates revenue unless we decide to keep the stadium well beyond the 40 years, or we get another team that comes in that decides they want to build a stadium here. I mean, this is the reality that we're looking at. I think that people trying to squeeze the same amount of monies from a stadium 20, 30, 40 years down the line is a little unrealistic. I'd like a comment about that. But again, we will have to look at a decision on, I mean, it's not this council, maybe not everyone on this council, but we're going to have to look at what we do with that stadium property. I have questions. I mean, I know you answered a little bit on page 34 of the slide 34, which was how does Stadium Authority debt get paid off if there's reduction in non-NFL event net revenue? And I know that we have the debt service budget, and we have debt service reserves. There must be a minimum amount in the reserve. We do get additional reserves in there. There's the CFD, the Community Facilities District contribution, and then transfers in from the operating budget around 17 million if I look at the numbers here. When I look at the operating budget, we have performance-based rent on top of the fixed ground rent. And the fixed ground rent, I mean, we could look at it several ways. We can look at the fixed ground rent as $1 million today based on the schedule, increasing, as the years go on. But the operating budget, the performance-based rent on top of the fixed ground rent is 50% of net non-NFL event revenue. And if there are no non-NFL events, then that's just, we don't have any additional performance-based rent because there were no performances. And we subtract the performance rent credit from the ground rent, which is 50% of the ground rent, which is currently $500,000 because the fixed ground rent is $1 million as of today. And this is the net performance rent paid. And if we look at the debt service budget, we subtract the community facilities district. Actually, it's like a hotel tax. But I would like a breakdown of the operating budget monies that give us the $17 million that go into the debt service budget. I know that we don't talk about this, but the facility rent, I believe, is the $24.8 million for the stadium managers half of the year, where that's their rent for the half of the year. That is what pays a lot of the loan. I mean, we have all this talk about non-NFL events, when the performance-based rents. But the reality is, I mean, if we don't have a team, if we don't have somebody paying the $24.8 million for their half of the year, the majority, I mean, all of the debt service budget kind of goes away. I don't think people fully understand this. I think that we've been making a big fuss about performance-based rent, but the performance-based rent is kind of a red herring. I mean, it's one of those things that we acknowledge that during COVID, there was no performance-based rent. There were no performances, and we still were able to pay down our loans. And I'd like a clear accounting of how that was able to be done. I believe that we are talking about the fixed ground rent, which is minimal. We got performance-based rent on top of the fixed ground rent, which is not necessarily minimal. It's not nothing, but what we don't talk about, what we don't hear about in these discussions, the facility rent. And the facility rent is paid by the stadium manager for the rent of the facilities, independent of how profitable the events are. And I think that, again, that's just like some acknowledgement that during COVID, when we had no events, what were the exact payments, what were the revenues that we received that were able to pay off the loans? Thank you.
Authority Member Cox.
Sorry, Director Lee, to double dip here. I'm glad that the renovation fund and demolition one was brought up, because I would like to understand what the difference is between a renovation fund and the capital expense fund. They seem to perhaps do the same projects or maybe serve some of the same purpose. And as I understand it, that now is underfunded significantly and will not be full until 2031, potentially. Based on the new capital expenditures. And just as a point of clarification, I see that the $1.7 million in other expenses was detailed out. There's an $838,000 line item that is staffing. Just as a point of clarification, I would like to know why that staffing line wasn't in the administration and staffing budgeted line item already existing in the operating budget, and it was chosen to be put into other expenses.
Thank you. I'm going to just follow up on that last question. Can we get a list of the positions that we're funding, all of the positions? I had the same question. Why were those two? Why is that in a separate, other category? So I have a couple of questions based upon the questions that you answered. The first was on the legal fees, but I didn't really get an answer besides you took a holistic view of legal work and you worked with the city attorney's office, but to have spent roughly $200,000 one year and then increase to $460 the next year, that's a huge increase. So I'd like a better detailed description on why, because I heard a lot of stuff, but I didn't really hear the answer there. The second was, I believe I asked the question, how much is the budget has been due to Super Bowl and World Cup preparations? Because I want to make sure the Bay Area Host Committee repays the Stadium Authority for those amounts. And your answers were that there was some vacant positions that covered the cost, but I never did get the costs of that. The last I heard was about $1.2 million, but I wanted to know exactly what those costs were. That was my question. And I saw the large explanation about the seat building license administration, but I see a lot of the stuff, but the questions really weren't answered because I wanted to know, my core question essentially was, are we overpaying for a shrinking book of business? And why are we overpaying when the amounts are shrinking? And so I see that their performance metrics, these are all the things we want to do, but knowing how many calls they made doesn't really tell me whether or not the cost per dollar of SBL revenue generated is reasonable. So I want to know, those costs didn't justify the size or the growth rate of that. And I wanted to know more about that because there isn't really any explanation for this. So I wanted to follow up on that. Okay, so here's a few more questions. As Levi Stadium we're entering now the second decade of operation. How do we distinguish between capital projects that are required to maintain the structural integrity and safe operations of the stadium versus enhancements requested to improve the tenant's operations or fan experience? More like tenant improvements. How are we differentiating what those are? And the Stadium Authority has an independent facility condition assessment. Is it actually underway? I think it's going to be underway at some point, and it's not going to be completed for a while. So how are we independently verifying the need for the $22 million of capital plan that's proposed this year? The lease structure that we have appears to generate about $4 million annually for capital reserves, yet the proposed budget is, far more than that. And the budgets coming forward are going to be far more than that. Does that indicate that our formula is no longer sufficient to support our long-term capital needs? And with increasing capital expenditures, growing public safety obligations, and declining reserves, and projections showing the general fund transfers potentially dropping to zero in future years, what's your staff's assessment of the long-term financial stability of this authority over the next 5 to 10 years? And for the record, can staff or the city attorney confirm whether Manco ever billed the Stadium Authority for off-site rent or rent for that office rent in any prior fiscal year since the stadium opened in 2014? And I want to know, can the city attorney Stadium Authority Attorney identify the specific provisions in the stadium lease operations agreement or management agreement that require the Stadium Authority to, number one, reimburse off-site office space for Manco, two, maintain SBL sales and services at the current staffing and cost levels, and three, fund the increased capital expenditures being requested before the Stadium Authority completes its own independent facility condition assessment. And my last question is, when Levi Stadium was approved, voters were told the project would not burden taxpayers and that the city would receive fair economic value for the use of its land through a combination of ground rent and performance-based revenues. If the rising capital expenditures eliminate excess revenues and future general fund transfers decline to zero, how does the authority ensure that the city continues to receive fair value for its land that voters expected under Measure J? I think those are my questions, I believe, for now. Oh, one last one, second to last one. Under the 2024 settlement agreement, the additional non-NFL ticket surcharge revenue is now used to reimburse public safety costs over the threshold. Does that effectively reduce the amount of revenue that would otherwise contribute to excess revenues and performance rent to the city? I found one more, Ken, sorry. Has the board ever approved the transition of the SBLs from construction financing tool to a permanent revenue and resale program? I don't think we have, but in case I missed a meeting. So those are our questions. Executive Director, do you want to save them for next Tuesday, or you want to answer some now? Can you answer all of them now?
Thank you, Board Chair. I think we should go through and facilitate Q&A. We have been taking notes. I do think some of your questions, if we have representatives from Manco on, they can chime in as well. But I'll start with Director Ken Lee to facilitate the Q&A, and then both your board counsel and myself will chime in as well.
Thank you.
All right, so I think it'll be a team effort. I know we have a representative from Manco online.
Who would that be?
Is it Alex Acton and Jihad?
You just got off, or did you put him over? Okay.
So maybe on some of the questions, Chair, around SBLs.
Right, I see him.
Do that, and then
Okay.
I'm sure both legal and executive director and I will tag team on some of these responses.
Thank you.
So it'll be a team effort here. So just going back through, board member Hardy, you asked about some of the numbers. I know there's a lot of numbers in the document, so let me try to clarify some of the numbers that you mentioned, and then your part of your question was around outstanding debt. I know there were a couple others that asked around debt, so I'll talk about those revenue sources and hopefully answer your question. So yes, you're right. So roughly $209 million in debt. When you look at next year's budget, it actually drops below 200, so $199 million in outstanding debt, significant accomplishment. Most of that outstanding debt is fixed rate, fixed debt, and so we have a payment schedule through the end of kind of the term of the debt. And so when we talked about the $4 to $5 million a year, I assumed that was around the SBL revenues in response to some of my questions. You know, as that initial $600 million of SBLs were sold, that payment plan, 10 years, was recently repaid about 2 years ago. And so with turnover in SBLs, working with our stadium manager, their expectation there is $4 to $5 million. And so I know there's a lot of concern. How do we continue to pay that outstanding debt? And so there are other revenue sources designed in both itemized in the budget and contemplated as part of the agreement. it was always contemplated that that initial tranche of debt, that $600 million via SBLs, would be used up front. And so on the back end of that debt payment, you can see, and it's in the document, that payment schedule varies and decreases is because the revenue lines were expected to decrease over time. But as I think it was Board Member Park pointed out, we do get facility rent, we do get NFL ticket surcharge, we do get naming rights. And so during COVID, when we had no non-NFL events, we did continue to pay our debt. And that was primarily funded through our facility rent and our naming rights. So there was a year where we had no events, no people, and so our ticket surcharge revenues were close to zero. When there were events, but they were just broadcasted, but no tickets, continued to suffer in terms of the NFL ticket surcharge, but that facility rent, as well as the naming rights, SBL revenues, continued to keep that operation and our ability to pay our debt. And then as your treasurer, it is expected with those additional revenue sources beyond the SBLs, that should be sufficient to pay our fixed rate debt. That protects our investors, our original bondholders, to ensure that that debt will be paid off completely. There was a question about my slide 9 on the net income. And so I interpreted that question and apologize, Board Member Cox, if I misinterpreted it. Just the wanting to understand from a financial operations perspective, how are we doing when it comes to balancing our revenues and our expenses? And so every year since, except for a couple COVID years, we've always had surplus dollars that have flowed through to the waterfall, either to fill operating reserves, capital reserves. Now we're in the point of demolition reserves. So all those extra revenues on a operations basis goes to fill those buckets. This year, with a $22 million or so proposed CapEx budget, that's made up of the roughly $4 million in our base capital expense contribution dictated by our lease agreements. It's roughly $12 million of carryover, so CapEx funds that were available in prior years allocated to a project, but since those projects aren't completed yet, both the expense and that associated cash goes to fund those projects. And then roughly $5.7 million of operating reserves. So that's cash that's sitting in our reserves, taken out to put towards additional CapEx. And so if, assuming there are additional operating revenues at the end of next year, it would replenish that operating reserve as part of the waterfall. So that was the intent behind slide 9, to show that we do have surpluses at the end of the year. They trickle through the waterfall, and then one-time sources are used to fund that $22 million CapEx budget that's proposed. The question around non-NFL event budgeting, it's always a little bit more of an art than a science, but totally understand your point with regards to being realistic, aggressive, and not super conservative, and that does affect financial planning.
If I could add to that. Unfortunately, the agreements do not give us the ability to prescribe Manco's budgeting practices, and you're absolutely right, and we've talked about that before. They really budget based on booked events, not anticipated events. And what has been the case is, based on when the budget is presented and adopted, generally every year additional non-NFL events have been booked after budget adoption. And so we know they're in the market trying to book additional events, but that revenue is not reflected. And I totally agree with you. It does not give us a full portrait of what the revenue stream will be for the upcoming year. And as budgets gets tighter, we don't have a very accurate forecasted picture of what the revenues are at our disposal. So we will continue to work with them. Connected to that question, I just want to highlight that there was another question with regard to the need to have 36 events within a 3-year period. Just want to note that we are currently at 23 events held. Important to note that based on the booked events for the upcoming fiscal year, so 36 minus 23, that leaves us 13. When you include the 6 FIFA events as well as the known booked non-NFL events, that's 11. So with 2 additional events booked, that will get to that 13 benchmark to hit that 36 events within a 3-year period. And I know that they're actively in the market, and so we will update the city council as additional events are booked.
Was that I think I figured it out. Regardless of if the management company books the 36 within the 3-year period, they would be the ones liable to pay that.
Yes, they are responsible. It does have a relationship impact on our relationship with our naming rights sponsor, because the naming rights contract with Levi's is with the Stadium Authority. And so we definitely want those 36 events booked and that benchmark met.
Okay, and then Board Member Cox, I think you had a question on slide 12 with regards to cash balances going up from 103 to 110. And so largely dictated via the waterfall and the lease agreements, but the largest of which is our renovation and demolition reserve, roughly $53 million. We do have an operating reserve of roughly $30 million. And then a couple other reserves that we do include in our forecasts. We're required to keep 3 months of operations kind of in this funding trust. And then there was, I believe it was Board Member Park mentioned our debt service reserve. That's roughly $10 million. So there's a handful of different reserves there. The increase from year to year are largely 3% inflation. That's outlined in the lease agreements. And the assumption here is as we have excess cash flow from operations.
35, 36. I think my concern with that is if we're projecting 103 million in the upcoming fiscal year, and the growth there is roughly 7 million, but we have 75 million in anticipated capital reserves, clearly we're outpacing. Our need is greater than our reserves, correct?
Yeah, I mean, the assumption over 10 years, and again, a loose assumption that we had to make, given very little information around capital needs down the road, is that as those needs grow, currently, 5.7 next year, but as they grow to $9 million, $14 million, that will continue to impact the amount of operating reserves that we would have. And we would look for operations to kind of fill that. And if it can't, that would impact those reserves as we go ahead. Then there was a question around what's the strategy with regards to this CapEx. And I know the executive director had a slide last Tuesday around next steps, which includes the facility condition assessment. And I know that, Javon, you want to kind of talk through that. But there is a broad strategy. I do want to note that it's very new information with regards to this new CapEx requirement, and so it will take some time to kind of work through that. But Javon, you want to kind of talk through that?
Absolutely. And it's a very fair and appropriate question of what is the strategy. And so why don't I outline a few things that we are undertaking and know that the strategy will evolve and develop further. So one of the first things we need to do is understand the problem that we're talking about. And in my experience, the numbers always get bigger as you go further out. So we're really just not going to be concerned about this 5-year forecast. It is a 40-year lease, and we're in year 12. And so the numbers will get large. And even what we're seeing now, we're starting to need to use operating reserves to fund capital. And so first, we need to receive the completed 49ers facilities condition assessment. We need to review that as well as conduct our own and hopefully reach agreement on what are the needed projects. Next, we need to be realistic. We oftentimes know that capital budgets can project to do X number of projects in a given year, but projects oftentimes roll over, right? And so we want to budget in a more realistic basis so that the projects, when they're budgeted, will actually be completed, because these are significant dollars and we don't want to develop solutions and be advancing money really before the money will actually be spent. And then frankly, prioritize and do the most important projects going forward. As far as funding strategies, there are any number of strategies that we need to employ, and I think the numbers will be so large that there may not be a silver bullet solution, and so we may need to employ multiple strategies. Drive more revenues. We've talked a lot about that, and through our marketing plan review, driving more non-NFL event revenues, as well as looking at any additional revenue streams. I know we've talked about an increased surcharges. Is there the ability to increase additional surcharges? Look at utilizing some of our existing revenue streams. We oftentimes talk about the demolition fund, but Board Member Cox, you actually called it by its real name. It's called the Renovation and Demolition Fund. And in the agreement, it's projected not to be needed until year 40, but we can engage a conversation about utilizing some of those funds sooner, right? Yes, it is being funded at a slower clip because of the split with the settlement agreement, but over, I think we're at about half of the $70 million now, and it's projected to be fully funded in, I believe, year 31, 30. It's about 52 million, the renovation and demolition fund.
Currently.
So 52 million of the 70 million, right? And so it's projected to be fully funded around year 31. And so we can have conversations about utilizing those funds sooner than year 40. Additionally, we can look at potentially debt financing some of the improvements. There are some benefits to not following a model where every capital project is paid with cash, right? If they are capital projects that have a long lifespan, do we bond for some of those potentially at a lower than 30-year bond horizon, but a longer term debt financing to spread over the time at which revenue is raised for those capital expenses. Renegotiating terms with the primary tenant, how the revenues flow through the agreement, payments and shared expenses between each parties. We may very well need to engage with that effort. And also it's important to note that the agreement includes a put right, where we can put the responsibility on the 49ers for full year-round operations of the stadium. That comes with it both pros and cons, and so that if the city does exercise that right, it's also important to note that that right would need to be exercised in this coming fiscal year, in the 13th year. And so we need to have those conversations as we engage in this analysis. But it is a very, very significant financial impact that we are grappling with and need to fully understand that, because the capital costs are now starting, as we've all said, to eat into operational expenses, and sufficient funds have not been set aside over the life of the stadium to fully fund the expected capital.
Okay, and then the next group of questions, I know almost every board member expressed concern, and rightly so, regarding the diminishing general fund projected revenue. And so Board Member Chahal asked, what tools do we have? And so just want to talk a little bit around what drives general fund revenue. And first and foremost, it's having money-making large events at the stadium. It's both football via the NFL ticket surcharge as well as non-NFL events. And so that drives performance rent. It helps pay for the ground rents. And then when it's talking about the excess revenues, and so what are some of the credits that get applied, both the performance rent and potentially excess revenue? It's around our public safety costs. And so I think a board member mentioned the new fee that was part of the 2024 settlement designed to cover the costs above the threshold. And so to the extent, both from a risk and deployment standpoint, our costs are maintained or controlled to the extent that we can receive more than $6 a ticket from a public safety costs surcharge, to the extent those events can demand that high of a ticket surcharge. Those will help drive the revenues that help to pay for public safety costs over the threshold. So if public safety costs over the threshold are covered by those fees, we have profit-making events. And our capital expenditure, that would impact the waterfall or the excess dollars That will help dictate what is our excess revenue at the end of the year. But as far as primarily, I know, Chair Mayor, you mentioned the market rate rent, the performance, and the ground rent. Those are the avenues and the tools that we have to kind of ensure that they're maximized profit-making events and making sure that ticket surcharge to cover our public safety costs are high and covering those costs. Board Member Gonzalez, you talked about a policy, a school district policy, and I know you've mentioned this on the city side with regards to capital. That is, absent an agreement that's restrictive, that's a good practice for any organization to have, to put aside a sinking fund to maintain the asset, the building. Our lease agreement, unfortunately, it's very restrictive with regards to capital dollars. I mentioned the base amount and that added amount, roughly $4 million. I know Mayor Chair Gilmore, you asked about whether that was a sufficient amount, and I can say for a $1 billion asset, it's a very low amount. Now, I can't go back and I don't know the conversations that happened when that amount was dictated, but what I can tell you that as that facility ages, there will be a need for additional investments into that, and so it's really important for us as a stadium authority to have an informed, independent assessment and prioritize those projects so that we use those very limited dollars to the best that we can. But from a policy standpoint, our lease agreement dictates the capital dollars that we set aside. Board Member Gonzalez, you also asked about the RFP for the economic consultant. Expect that to be back. My guess is it would take a 3 to 6 month time frame to kind of contract, start the work, and then take a look at some of those initial results. But we're hoping that that's back later this calendar year. Board Member Park asked about debt service and how it's paid. I answered some of them. I do want to kind of mention, we are ahead of what was contemplated around the CFD repayment or advance or hotels. That 2% that's applied to hotel rooms has done well, and so we are ahead of what were the initial projections. And as I mentioned earlier, that $200 million of debt outstanding. And so we do have a variety of funds beyond non-NFL events that would help support that. I mentioned what we used during COVID.
Excuse me, Ken, 1 second. City Clerk, you had something to say.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just would like to note for the record that Board Member Shahal has left the meeting.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ken.
Then Board Member Cox, you had just the clarification on the demo reno fund, what's different versus capital expenditures. I'll explain it broadly. Like every organization has to have a fund, a sinking fund to maintain the assets. This facility, our city has it as well. So those are the type of expenditures for a capital kind of maintenance sinking fund. The agreement included a renovation demolition fund at the end of the term because depending on the state of the asset, what's out in the market, I believe that the cost of demolition was going to be significant. So the authority or the parties that agreed to that part of the agreement wanted to protect the authority from that cost. And I don't have details around renovation. I know there are elements of our agreement that do contemplate if there's a large renovation at what point in time and some of the terms, but I'd have to get back to you on the renovation part of that fund.
And I just wanted clarification because I think I misspoke and then maybe led this the wrong way, but I believe in the proposed budget, the demolition and renovation fund was targeted to be funded by 2031, and now we're saying that it will not be done within the next 10 years. Is that correct?
That is correct, and so the source of supplying dollars to that demolition renovation fund is that excess revenue, and to the extent we have larger capital needs that require operating reserves to be used, then the flow of funds is to fill back that operating reserve first before the renovation demolition fund gets filled. So it will slow and potentially stop to the extent that those buckets for operating reserves aren't filled later on further Then there was a question around other expenses and why are they separate? And so we've had other expenses in the budget for quite some time. In the agreement, there are, I believe, clauses around specific stadium authority requests. And so the initial funding of staff from other expenses were around requests by the stadium authority to develop and build a financial management system. There were some positions around that implementation that the board also approved, and accountant-type positions and financial-type positions. By practice, some of the positions that have also charged there were around non-NFL event business analytics, so very specific positions related to the non-NFL event business. Mayor, you requested a list of positions. We will make sure you get that. We have that. That's part of our review of the documents. And so that's why there. And then the two additional capital project managers with the capital program increasing, and because the Stadium Authority is the primary party in maintaining that facility, the proposed budget includes those two positions to help address any of those capital positions. There was also a question I do want to point out in terms of how those projects get prioritized. How do we ensure that they're not enhancing certain areas or their maintenance? And so a couple things. One is we get a detailed list from our stadium manager through a position in our executive director's office. There is engagement on a regular basis, both in monthly meetings and with their director of the facility, to understand and determine the needs of the facility. So we do have a dedicated resource dedicated resource in our executive director's office for capital. We will continue through facility condition assessment to analyze what an independent consultant's recommendations are, and to make sure those most critical systems, as the executive director mentioned, the state mandate for the LEDs, are very important and are funded. John, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Just want to add to that. The LED project is approximately half of the $10 million capital project request for this year, and we are very familiar with that. State law, we have to comply with it as well, and there's a phased-in approach depending on facility type. In addition, as we are entering, and I think the mayor called it phase 2 of the life of the stadium, we are certainly having additional conversations internally around what additional facility capital consultants and/or staffing we may need as we go forward and are entering into more complex repairs and renovations of the stadium so that we can appropriately assess and vet requests.
Okay, and then Mayor, you had a handful of questions. This is where I'll need a team effort, and so there's some questions on SBLs that I will, at the end, have our Manco representative answer. I know some of these were directed at Glenn, so I'll have Glenn answer. But your first question that I'll attempt here is, how much is allocated for World Cup planning within our G&A budget? And so because the agreements dictate that existing budgeted G&A staff will continue to be paid for by Stadium Authority versus Bay Area Host Committee, we do not have kind of a segregated time. Like, I don't have a specific number of hours for my time involvement for World Cup. We would have to go back and do that analysis and bring that forward. And so because of how kind of the agreement dictated existing budgeted staff, that's why that.
Can I follow up on that? Because I think you have like 20% of your time, and city executive director has 20% of his time. But I did get a correspondence from the city manager a couple months ago. I'll have to dig it out. That said about $1.2 million of money used for planning Super Bowl and World Cup were billed to the Stadium Authority. So I'll dig that up and look at it, but that's why, that should be above and beyond your 20%, because there was a tremendous amount of time spent preparing with all the probably legal fees and planning fees, and everything, which was above and beyond. So that's what I'm asking for. I wanted to know, I think a few months ago, it was like $1.2 million. I assumed it has grown since, so that's why I wanted a specific number.
Thank you.
If I could get that before Tuesday, and I will dig up that.
Thank you, Chair, for clarifying. So I was referring to the budget, but we do have a time allocation system that does, like, so when I do actually work on FIFA, I do have a separate charge code. That's where,
That you build the stadium authority for, or the city? What I'm talking about is the stadium authority billing.
Stadium Authority.
Let me articulate. Mayor, that communication you're referring to, it was a summary of time that staff spent in pre-planning and negotiation and planning time for people whose normal budget is billed to the Stadium Authority. And as I think the treasurer was just about to say, we do have codes for people that bill, and that bill will be invoiced to Manco. We also have, the Bay Area Host Committee. We also have payroll codes for staff like myself who may be working on a Super Bowl or FIFA event, and that is tracked but not billed as per the assignment and assumption in League Event Agreement. And so we can pull those numbers, and I do believe that summary numbers is what you're referring to.
Yeah, I was wondering the ones that were, I'm still waiting for the city ones because the dashboard needs to be updated. That's another, long discussion. But I want to keep track of what was billed to the Stadium Authority so we can get it reimbursed. Thank you.
All right, and then there was the comment around long-term viability. And so I will say, as the treasurer, as Stadium Authority staff, we have responsibilities to bondholders to make sure that debt is paid. We have a desire and on the city side to maximize general fund revenues, and then as a facility, as many people flow through and it's on TV, to ensure that facility is maintained as a world-class facility, so working with our stadium manager. And so our goal here really is to keep that facility vibrant, active, and money-making. The next couple questions, I know there were questions, Glenn, for you around the legal budget, and then offsite.
I'll take a
So
couple
there's a
of the ones
group
that I
there.
know
I don't
are
know if you
mine,
wanna comment
and then I'll toss it back to you. Madam Mayor, thank you for the questions. On starting with the legal budget, as you all know, legal costs, generally can vary dramatically, from year to year, depending upon, the issues that arise for that particular year. And it's an imperfect process in predicting what those costs, will be. Nonetheless, that is what the process that we engaged in with the providing this estimate based on, and that's what we mean by a holistic view, evaluating, the history of what kind of legal costs there were, what we know about existing claims, and projections in general based upon our history on the kinds of things that are likely to arise, in the upcoming year. Sue Reuter from my group manages litigation both for the city and for the Stadium Authority, and so she was really on the front line of this analysis, and this projection. I don't want to provide really any details of the projected issues that we might have, upcoming, but there are, as the different kind of types of legal issues arise, we do inform you of these in our quarterly litigation updates. That includes both the city, and the Stadium Authority. And Mayor, if you'd like, in trying to put this one in this particular year in context, we could, when we come back on Tuesday, I don't have that with me today, provide some historical data about, what the costs have been.
That would be great, because this seems like this is a huge jump. And I
Yeah, and it's-
still haven't heard any reason for it. I mean, I know there's regular suits and other things, but
Yeah. So
this is huge jump.
it's not actually, Mayor, in terms of
100
what's.
to
No, that
460?
you're
Am I wrong?
no, you're comparing the actuals from a previous year as opposed to comparing to what we've budgeted from year to year. And so that's the difference, Mayor. We had you could call it a good year last year, right? That the kinds of costs that the legal costs that we incurred.
So you're going to give me the year before that and the year of actuals?
Yeah, if you want to
Of all
see
the
that, Mayor. So that's
actuals.
what I'm saying. A particular good year doesn't mean that's what it's going to be in the next year. And so that's what the holistic approach means. You look at existing claims, you look at the history of the kind of costs you've incurred, you look at the kinds of things that you're expecting to come up in the upcoming year.
So you're expecting a lot of litigation next year in the Stadium Authority based on that budget?
I don't think that's accurate, Madam Mayor, and we'll provide you
From
a
200 to 460. Okay. All right.
Yeah, again, Mayor, I think there's the conflation is between actuals and projections, and I think that this budgeted year is consistent with a lot of previous budgeted years with the same kind of calculation going into it. So we'll provide some additional detail in a back memo if necessary, Madam Mayor. I'll ask Sue to put that together. Again, she's on the front line of it, so you can get the information that you need to evaluate it. Definitely want to get that to you. I know you had a couple of other questions that were in my arena as well, Madam Mayor. One of them was, and it's really more of a budget question, but I can answer to the best of my knowledge. You said, do I have any knowledge of in the operations of the stadium, that the Stadium Authority ever being charged in any budget or request for cost recovery, the rental costs for Manco personnel?
Office space.
I'm sorry, for office space, and the answer, as I understand it, is no. And that's one of the reasons why, when this line item came to our attention, we were surprised by it and are, as you know, from both last year and continuing this year, are resistant to it. So there's no information to suggest that that was something that was charged previously. You, Mayor, also asked about if there are provisions in the contract that require us to approve capital expenditures or the SBL kind of service costs. And I think the general answer for that is no. For capital expenditure costs, there's a section in the stadium lease 10.4 that has a detailed procedure, like a lot of these provisions have, for Manco preparing, the capital expenditure budget, submitting it to us reviewing it, and responding back, but us having approval rights over those expenditures. And so there's nothing that requires, that, but there is, to the extent there's a disagreement, a dispute resolution, process for that. I would answer similarly, although I don't have the provisions on the SBL costs, to the extent that's a cost that they're looking to recover, there may be provisions in the SBL agreement itself that dictate that. But Mayor, my expectation would be that that would also be a matter of our review and dispute resolution to the extent we don't think those costs are appropriate. Finally, Mayor, I think the last question you had was, at least for me, was regarding the kinds of things that we would do to assure that the fair market value contemplated by Measure J, was delivered. The Measure J absolutely has a provision like that, Madam Mayor. It says, as you probably know as well as anyone, that the city is supposed to receive payment into the city's general fund of fixed-based rent and performance-based rent that together are projected to provide fair market, rent. And at the time that this Measure J, approved by the voters with a very detailed term sheet, was attached to it, was approved by you, KMA had done an analytical study to determine what that fair market value, rent would be, and determined that based upon not even looking at excess revenues, I believe, but just the ground rent and the performance-based rent, that in fact that would be achieved. There's nothing in the contract that guarantees a particular amount of money any given year or even over the life of the project, but it's definitely in the spirit of the agreement and in KMA's analysis that there are certain expectations about that. I don't know if there's been a study since that original analysis that updates the council as to where, or the board, as to where we're at, with that as compared to what the KMA analysis. That might be
It was
useful,
in Exhibit
Mayor.
J of the stadium lease.
I'm sorry?
It was in Exhibit J of the stadium lease.
Yeah, no, but I mean, yeah, but I don't think there's been an update of that, of
No.
KMA's analysis to say, hey, where are we at? KMA projected
Well,
this amount would be generated over
Well,
time.
yeah, it's well above what we're getting right now. And what we should have been receiving is well
Yeah, I don't know that that's true, Madam Mayor, but that's certainly
Oh, it is.
worth visiting
true.
that analysis, because that was the premise at the time, was that it was
Correct.
it was a projection based on KMA's analysis for those two
Yeah,
things.
if
So
you- if
that
you
would be
look
the
at it, if you look at Exhibit J, we can discuss it next.
Yeah, very good. It's a complicated.
Take a look. It's not that complicated. Take a look at it, and you'll see.
Very good, Mayor. And you and I
projected
can talk about that.
Performance-based rent and ground rent together.
That's right, Madam Mayor. And
Yeah.
again, what I'm referring to is KMA's present value analysis of what that number would be, and I don't think we've done an updated analysis to compare where we're
No,
at
and
with
so,
that.
so the question is, if we're not achieving that, are we violating Measure J?
Yeah, and
That's my question. If we're not achieving, near or anywhere close to, especially if our performance rent ends up at little or nothing.
yeah, and I'll provide additional
All right,
information on
thank
that,
you.
Mayor.
Thank you.
I think that was it for me on the legal side.
I think I have two more questions for you, Mayor, or answers, and then I'll turn it over to Alex online regarding SBLs and
All
the
right.
status of the FCA. So, Mayor, you asked the 2024 settlement surcharge revenue, is it reduced revenues? And so I'll talk about two things. One is, that additional non-NFL ticket surcharge is new revenue, so that helps us just from a revenue standpoint. And then it's designed to cover public safety costs. And so public safety costs vary based on safety deployment dictated by our public safety partners. And then that revenue can also vary based on the number of non-NFL tickets sold. So it's not a sure bet that those revenues cover those costs. That's obviously the goal and the intent. And so when we're looking at our forecasts and we're trying to make assumptions about how many events, the size of those events, the likely fee for that additional surcharge, and the cost of public safety costs, it gets to a point where we would need to dip into the discretionary fund and other sources in order to cover that. Obviously, a lot of assumptions when you're looking at a 10-year crystal ball, but that's how that works. And then you had a question around, has the board approved the use of construction fund dollars to permanent revenue? And I know that the issuance and the topic of the construction fund dollars and what balances there predated my time here in Santa Clara. And so I'll have to take that one back and see what's available. I know there is a bucket in here for warranty work that was derived from the original kind of development of the stadium. That warranty work or that bucket has carried over from year to year. Our goal is to kind of dig into what projects of that remains with our stadium manager and potentially liquidate that to permanent revenue. But I'll have to dig in further if there's other construction fund dollars there that you're referring to. I think that concludes the questions I have. I want to turn it over to Alex online. Alex, just to frame it, is the FCA underway and status of that? There was a question around SBL administration and just kind of the cost return for that, especially as SPL revenues decline. And so if you have any comments, Alex, would appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Director Lee. I appreciate you all having me. Good evening, everyone. My name is Alex Acton. I'm the Director of Finance here for the San Francisco 49ers. And before I just expand on that answer, I do want to note quickly that I am also a registered lobbyist. I can roll through the SBL sales and service question, and then I will actually turn around and kick it to my colleague Jihad to talk over the FCA stuff. So I think on the SBL sales and services component, I think it's actually important to right now, $1.3 million of that sales and service budget is dedicated to sales staff. And that staff, their goal is to secure long-term revenue for the SCSA. The revenue that is sold typically is financed over a 10-year period. So the $5 million goal that you saw in some of the responses, that $5 million of revenue that is sold this year will actually be received in cash over the course of the next 10 years. So you're securing long-term revenue for the Santa Clara Stadium Authority. And I know there's a lot of conversations tonight about future revenues. This investment of $1.3 million is actually serving that purpose. On the service side, those costs really must be viewed really in the context of the entire SBL program, which at this point is over $600 million. These costs will actually always exist for the authority. The service team manages the ongoing relationship with your current SBL holders. They handle all the relocations and the inquiries that actually come with that. And so without that kind of infrastructure in place, you risk customer retention, and that team sends out the invoices to actually collect on the cash. And so outside of also answering non-NFL event questions, or kind of just the general customer support for SBL questions. So that cost in of itself will always exist for the Stadium Authority. Jihad, do you want to expand on the FCA stuff?
Yep, thank you, board, for having us. I just want to go walk through Jihad Beachman, EVP General Counsel of the 49ers. Just wanted to walk through our current status on the facility condition assessment. Our team continues to work diligently on that. We are hoping to have that completed during the upcoming fiscal year 26-27. We'll obviously continue to work with SCSA staff once we have official drafts of those documents to ensure that they have input and other ideas that they can provide us as related to those costs. But we're hopeful that that process will be complete at some point during the upcoming fiscal year. Did want to touch on two additional items that were noted and discussed today. The first, I believe there was either a question or a statement surrounding the PSC, Public Safety Cost Surcharge on non-NFL events, and its impact on performance rent in the, I believe it was stated that the Public Safety Cost Surcharge actually decreased performance rent to the city. But I know it can be a little bit complicated, but it was actually constructed to increase the performance rent that's going to the city. And so the best way that I can try to illustrate this is that if you have a year where there are, let's just say, $10 million in non-NFL in profit, and there are $2 million of public safety costs above the threshold, in our old system, you would have taken that $10 million, divided it by 2 to have $5 million, and then subtracted out the $2 million in public safety cost credits to pay for those public safety costs. And so what would have resulted would have been $3 million going to the city out of that $10 million in profit from non-NFL events. Using the structure that we created through the settlement that occurred in 2024, what ends up happening is you have now $8 million in profit and $2 million in public safety cost surcharge, assuming you keep the revenues relatively the same. Most of the time it's not exactly that, but assuming that to be the case, you would essentially no longer need to pull out of the public safety cost credits out of the profit. And so you'd end up taking the $8 million profit, dividing it by 2, and you'd pay out $4 million to the city in public safety in performance rent. So what ends up happening in our new case scenario is you have $4 million in performance rent being paid out to the city, instead of that $3 million being paid out to the city. So the way that we've structured it now as a result of the settlement actually increases the amount of rent that goes out, performance rent that goes out to the city. And I did also want to just cover the city attorney, stadium authority attorney pointed out that when you look at that fair market rent that was calculated under the original Measure J, it is in fact true that it did not include excess revenues. And if you look at Exhibit J from the lease that was put together with the original projections from the stadium, there were no excess revenues that would have gone to the city at this point in the lease. So we're actually at this point a little bit over $11 million ahead of funding dollars to the city from these excess revenues. And so that is a benefit of what also from the settlement that occurred, but also a benefit of just the work that this stadium authority and the stadium manager have done together And that's one of the things that I think that we are driving towards, kind of harping on when we're in this setting where we're talking about just the Stadium Authority Board. That obviously there's been a lot said about driving revenue to the city, but the Stadium Authority Board and the Stadium Authority, its purpose is to ensure that it complies with its agreements and that it has the stadium kept in the required condition as required by the lease. And so when we speak to the Stadium Authority Board in this capacity, that's what we're talking about, ensuring the Stadium Authority make sure that that's part of the narrative here. And it's not just about the city's interest, which we totally respect and understand, and hoping to drive as much performance run as possible, but also ensuring that the Stadium Authority's interests in that separate legal entity body are also kept as in mind as we have these discussions about how we keep the stadium in its current required condition.
Are you finished? Is that it?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Authority Member Hardy.
Thank you. Now that we have our 49ers representatives online, I had a specific question. I wanted to understand something that was proposed to be added to the budget over an armed guard. If you could explain that, please.
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that one as well. So, we constantly reevaluate our security practices. And, we typically don't talk about all of our security practices publicly. There are parts of our security practices that get updated on an annual basis. And so, as we make those changes, as we make those revisions, we're happy to work with the Stadium Authority staff to ensure that we are maintaining the stadium in a safe environment for all workers and all people who have events at the stadium. And so there are elements that we have added to the budget for this year. I don't want to speak specifically about the security procedures that we're implementing publicly, but happy to have those discussions with staff about the necessities and what the requirements are in order to maintain a safe stadium for our employees and for events at the stadium. We share in those costs, and we understand that those costs change from year to year, but it is something that we believe is reasonable and necessary to ensure the safety of our staff and ensure the safety of events at the stadium.
Thank you.
Any questions? Anyone? Councilmember Park. Authority Member Park.
Yeah, so I think that a lot of questions have come up. I mean, we've got a demolition fund that we decided on over a decade ago. Are we tracking how costs are going up for demolition? I mean, costs are rising. At the same time, are we looking at, I think the city attorney mentioned this, that are we looking at how fair market value is going down? Are we looking at different ways? I mean, again, I don't know how reasonable it is to expect the stadium to retain its value through its lifetime year after year after year. I would think that there would be diminishing returns. I think that there would be an increasing costs as we go into maintenance, as you would for any piece of hardware. And I think that we need to manage our city budgets to take into account the diminishing source that is our stadium. Again, it will go away completely unless we have a plan, a post-stadium plan for getting revenue from that area, because, again, even Measure J, even the contracts that we have don't go on forever. So I don't think that the time for those conversations is now, but we're definitely going to have those conversations going forward. And I think that if we could perhaps also get a presentation on how the stadium costs and how the stadium revenues will change, so that we don't have the expectations that we're just going to continue, steady through the next few decades. I think that would be a good thing as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? All right. Thank you very much. City Executive Director, what's that? Do you have comments on that?
No additional comments. We should go to the public.
Oh, I know that. I'm just wondering before I...
No additional comments. Understand the questions that have been asked, and Councilmember Park or Board Member Park, totally understand your question around the long-term life of the stadium and condition replacement. So we will work on that.
Thank you. All right, now I'm going to go to the member of the public that is online. Would anyone like to speak? Would he like to speak? All right, seeing none. So we'll continue this conversation on Tuesday? All right. Thank you very much, everyone. And this meeting's adjourned.